Tomorrow we're going to read the Parsha of Behaalotcha, a very long and very interesting Parsha with a broad spectrum of topics, opening up with the commandment of lighting the menorah in the Holy Temple. How was it so? Because in the previous Parsha we spoke about the dedication of the altar in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in a sense the portable precursor to the temple in the 40 years in the desert, the home for God, or the home for God's revelation. And for its inauguration, each of the 12 tribes brought special gifts to celebrate its inauguration. However, the Kohanim were not amongst that group. They, in fact, are the group of people who serve in the temple and not normally considered to be possessors of a lot of property and so on, because their primary enterprise was to serve in the temple itself. So the task and burden and indeed privilege of bringing all the other gifts fell upon the other tribes. All of a sudden we have at the beginning of Parshat Behaalotcha, Aaron being told how to light the menorah, Behaalotcha et hanerot, when you light the candles, and yet the word Behaalotcha actually means when you bring up the candles, from the word aliyah, an ascent, you cause the flames to rise upwards. And the juxtaposition of the commandment for the tribe of the Kohanim, the priestly tribe, to light the menorah, coming immediately after the gifts brought by the other tribes, prompts the Talmud to comment that this is not a coincidence, but rather it was meant as a comfort to Aaron. Why? The Talmud interpolates, and indeed this comment is brought in the commentary of Rashi on the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, that when Aaron saw how all the other tribes had the merit to bring special gifts and offerings for the inauguration of the altar, it says chalsha da'ato. In Hebrew it means his senses became weakened. He had an enormous sense of loss that neither he nor any members of his tribe who could represent him were privileged to bring these offerings. And so the commandment to light the menorah is looked at as God's response, according to this interpretation, that he should not feel bad, because he has even a greater task, bringing light to the temple, in a sense light to the world, because indeed, as the Talmud comments, the place of God's presence doesn't actually need light, but the idea was that the light is first and foremost a siman, an indication that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, dwells in Israel. And furthermore, this light is meant to disseminate to the entire world in a spiritual sense, and that is why we find, in the words of the prophets, that unlike most windows, which would be wide on the inside and narrower on the outside, the openings, because the idea is to bring in the light from the outside into the dwelling, the conception of the Holy Temple was the exact opposite. The openings were broader on the inner part, or rather narrow on the inner part, and widening outwards, because the whole concept of the Holy Temple and the light that was there, the spiritual light emanating from the physical light of the menorah, was not to bring in light to itself, but to disseminate the light outwards. Anyway, this incredible service to God and to mankind would be done by Aaron HaKohen. And this was meant to comfort him. It was God's answer that although they did not bring gifts, but they have this incredible other task, bringing light to the temple, light to the nation of Israel, and light to the entire world. But what is remarkable about Aaron's response is that in the religious sphere, as we are accustomed to compartmentalizing and indeed deprioritizing the spiritual aspects of our life, we see that Aaron's response was the exact opposite. That we may not reject our spiritual obligations, but it does not mean that we feel bad or we feel at a loss when we discover that there's something we don't have to do. where Aaron was very different. He wanted to be active in everything. He actually felt a sense of loss, but not being included in a great mitzvah. And so we see that the desideratum is to strive and for ambition to be more involved, to be able to do more in our service, more in our divine service, and so on. And this is exemplified by Aaron. That very same theme, by the way, we find later in the same parsha, because we have a remarkable episode called the Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach offering, and it had to do with the fact that people came to Moshe. They explained that at the time that the original Pesach, the original Paschal offering was offered in Egypt on the 14th day of Nisan, they were unable to offer it because they were ritually impure, which generally means they'd come into contact with a corpse, which is the epitome of impurity, God being the living God. And we know that contact with a corpse renders one ineligible to bring an offering. And so they were not able to do so. But there is no negative here per se. They just were not able to do it. It is not looked at as neglect on their part. The oral tradition opines that these were the very people who were involved in the burial of Joseph, because as you may recall, it was imposed upon the children of Israel that although Joseph had to be buried in Egypt, but he administered an oath that when the exodus occurs, they are to take his remains to the Holy Land, remove them from Egypt. And since that particular task fell upon this group of men, they were ritually impure at the time that the original Paschal offering was to be brought. But they are not happy with this. They don't say, oh, we lucked out. They feel deprived of that privilege, similar to the previous example of Aaron HaKohen. They come to Moshe and say, Lama nigara, why should we be worse? And so Moshe was at a loss as to what the answer should be. And so he asks God, indeed another theme of this parsha, the unique quality of Moses' prophecy, that he was able to, in a sense, address God when he needed the input and divine inspiration as to how the commandments should be performed. And through this situation, there arose the commandment of what is called the second Pesach, the Pesach Sheni. Now, obviously, everything in Torah would have had to come anyway. But as the commentaries explained, that it came about through the merit of these men who were so desirous and so eager not to miss out on the fulfillment of any commandment. So therefore, it came about that this meritorious act of the revelation of this mitzvah came about through these men. And so God explains that those who were ritually impure or were far away from the place where the Paschal offering had to be brought, they have a second opportunity. It is a month later, the 14th day of Iyar, month number 2, they can bring the Pesach Sheni. And the Pesach Sheni in Jewish tradition has become symbolic and indeed the prototype of the idea of what is described in the Yiddish expression, Nishtokein Farfalin, that nothing is ever totally lost. There's always a second chance. We should never feel despair that we have lost our opportunity to be part of the fulfillment of God's commandments, of the study of the Torah, and so on. And so the beginning of the parsha with Aaron HaKohen being told about the lighting of the menorah, and then again regarding those who said, Lama nigara, why should we miss out on bringing this offering to God? We discover that the attitude of the Jew should be that we yearn to do what needs to be done. We look at every commandment as an opportunity to unite with God, and hence we don't feel a sense of relief. Oh, good, I was exempt from that. Great. No, on the contrary, we seek to be actively involved as much as possible. And that, in fact, those are the really remarkable messages of those two incidents. I'd like to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and let's stay in touch.